a fella that you couldn't get angry with. He wouldn't let you get angry with him. He'd do something wrong, and most of the time, everything he did, you know, we had to get on him about it. But he'd just look at you and grin, and you say, "Oh, hell with it," and let it go, you know. You couldn't get him to do right. He did what he wanted to do. Oh man, he was just a kid throwing newspapers for the Morning Advocate and State Times. I think he was just about 15 years old, and his mother didn't want me to teach him to fly, and I told her, I said, "Lou, if I don't teach him to fly, he's just going to go next door. There's 4 schools out at the downtown airport." And I said, "He's going to learn to fly. He's made up his mind. He's going to learn to fly." I said, "You want him to fly with me or somebody you don't know?" She said, "Go ahead and teach him." And he was real easy to teach. He was a first cousin to a bird.
James Poche was a pilot who grew up with Barry.
He was a pilot, and Barry already had a commercial operation. He was a charter pilot, and that's pretty rare in high school.
Then, while most young men his age were still working up the courage to ask their girl to go steady, Barry Seal began demonstrating his courage by flying daring undercover missions into Cuba, bringing Fidel Castro's insurgents weapons courtesy of the American CIA. David Holmes is another Baton Rouge pilot who grew up with Barry.
Barry was just the kind of guy you could talk to, and he was very friendly, jovial, and everything else, but when you finished talking to him, you didn't know any more than when you started.
Yeah, Barry had a lot of secret lives. He loved that James Bond shit, you know.
He knew Johnny Rivers, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, yeah. We used to fly Johnny around. Yeah, secret agent man.
Was that song about Barry?
I often wonder.
When did the rumors about his flying P-51s start?
Well, that was all around that Cuban time down there when people were, you know, being ferried out of there, and I heard rumors to that effect, you know, that Barry was down there flying, and he disappeared during those periods of time.
The anti-Castro revolution touched Louisiana, and especially its small pilot fraternity, in ways the rest of the country knew nothing about.
There was a lot of guys back then who were supposed to be flying to South America that you heard about. That, hey, the Gulf Coast was wide open to them. Anything could have happened. United Fruit was real big in Central America, and they were running clandestine planes. And
it was a brand new twin-engine airplane, an Apache, and the man said he wanted to rent the airplane to make a swing around the country, the southwestern part of the country, to buy airplanes. And what he did, he went on down into Cuba with that airplane, landed on the highway, and was flying people out for so much money, and got shot down, and Reggie lost his airplane on account of the war clause. The insurance company wouldn't pay it.
I had no idea how big it was till I hit down in Miami and met a few Cubans and realized there's some crazy things going on. There was a time in history.
But for those who flew at the Bay of Pigs, and those who knew them, 40 years later there is still a reluctance to talk.
What's funny is he used to sit around and read these Soldier Fortune magazines, and one day we might go to Cuba and this and that. He mentioned it, and Barry was all into that. He liked that arms smuggling and clandestine life type stuff. And back at that age, man, you want a P-51 and a Thunderbird to drive in and pick up pretty girls, you know. And yeah, he fantasized about it. I don't know if it happened or not. But
we ended up with Thunderbird, didn't we?
Yeah. Yeah. Several of them.
For over 40 years, the story of how Barry Seal was recruited into the CIA, into America's clandestine services, has been a well-kept secret. No longer. This is a picture of 16-year-old Seal preparing to step onto a U.S. Air Force plane, bound for a 2-week summer camp of the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol at Barksdale Air Force Base. There he will meet fellow cadet Lee Harvey Oswald, and there both will fall into the orbit of the freakish David Ferrie, best remembered by his portrayal by actor Joe Pesci in Oliver Stone's film JFK.
There was another Civil Air Patrol unit at Lakefront Airport in New Orleans, and that was a decidedly different Civil Air Patrol unit. The leader of the New Orleans Lakefront Airport Civil Air Patrol Unit was a guy named David Ferry. David Ferry was a professional airline pilot with Eastern Air, flew for Eastern. One Friday night, Barry called my brother. Now, they were teenagers at the time. They were both in high school, and Barry asked my brother John, said, "Do you want to fly over to Lacombe with me in the morning?" And they left out that morning at 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and got to Lacombe probably 30 minutes later. When they landed on the tarmac, my brother saw some interesting things. One was that there were two groups of people out there assembled. One was the Civil Air Patrol unit from Lakefront, and again, this 50 or 60 boys, and they were in formation. The other group was what appeared to be, my brother doesn't speak Spanish, but he understood that they were Spanish-speaking men. They were wearing military fatigues, combat boots, and the distinctive green fatigue cap that soldiers wear. He said there was a very strange-looking man sitting in a director's chair. It was a black folding director's chair, and the man had a .45 caliber pistol strapped to his side in a leather holster. And what was so strange about him was that he appeared to be wearing a complete wig, in addition to having strange-looking eyebrows, and he had obviously no body hair. Because my brother didn't know this at the time, but it was David Ferry, and David Ferry had a rare skin disorder, and he had no hair on his body. Periodically, Barry would point to the crates, and sometimes David Ferry would point to the crates. And after about 10 minutes of conversation, Barry came back over to my brother. He says, "John, how'd you like to make about $400 a week?" And to put this in perspective, my dad made about $400 a month, and he was asking my brother if he wanted to make $400 a week. And my brother said, "Well, what, doing what?" He said, "Flying planes with me." As we later discovered, David Ferry was probably at the time working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and it appears that Barry Seal was working for David Ferry.
While still an impressionable teenager, both Barry Seal and Lee Harvey Oswald came under the tutelage of a man you wouldn't want your worst enemy's kid to know, David Ferry, a pedophile, and worse.
Oh, he's a real weird guy. Wore a wig, looked like somebody's carpet that he took off the floor and put on his head. It was real strange. He was a real strange guy. Every now and then it would fall off. He'd be talking to you and it would slip, and he was bald-headed. He lived in the quarters, and he held weddings at his house, and just weird things. He'd marry street people, and there was parties, and he was just one of them guys.
Something strange went on in the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol of the middle 1950s. Something which will lead us onward like a trail of breadcrumbs through the signal events of America's secret history in the second half of the 20th century.
First time you ever heard his name was during one of these joint maneuvers with the New Orleans Civil Air Patrol unit. And the guy was a very popular member of the Civil Air Patrol. His name was Lee. And my brother heard the man's name for the second time in his life. In November 1963, November 22nd to be exact, when it was announced on the TV news that President Kennedy had been assassinated, and that the person that they had taken in custody and charged with the murder was Lee Harvey Oswald, the same man my brother had known as a member of the Civil Air Patrol unit in New Orleans. It's obvious that David Ferry, as commander of that Civil Air Patrol unit in New Orleans, was the commander for Lee Harvey Oswald. Probably at the time that these Cuban soldiers were being trained in Lacombe. And it doesn't take a mental giant to put the rest of it together. You just have to figure, well, if Oswald was under Ferry in the Civil Air Patrol, now here's Oswald being inculpated in connection with the assassination of the President of the United States a few years later. Some very strange things were happening in the New Orleans and Baton Rouge areas back then.
The House Select Committee on Assassinations tried to find Oswald and David Ferry's records in the Civil Air Patrol files, but in the first in a sordid series of lost and stolen documents that have kept America's secret history hidden from the American people, they discovered that most of the records of the squadron had been stolen. One record, which escaped being stolen, however, reveals that Oswald joined the Civil Air Patrol on July 27, 1955, while at summer camp with Dave Ferry and Barry Seal. Here we recall how for 40 years Warren Commission apologists have tried to tell us that Oswald and Ferry didn't even know each other. But we didn't have to look any further than the New Orleans Public Library to meet someone who knew different. Colin Hamer was a fellow Civil Air Patrol cadet with Lee Harvey Oswald in David Ferry's squadron.
Lee Harvey Oswald was in my Civil Air Patrol unit from the summer, sometime in the summer of 1955. I was in recruit class with him.
As it turns out, the feds were interested in David Ferry and Barry Seal long before the Kennedy assassination.